Great, thank you. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here today on our webinar. Today, the chair and the vice chair of the Appraisal Standards Board will be summarizing the board's proposed changes to USPAP. So Nick and Michelle, if you'd like to introduce yourselves real quickly.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your time in attending this webinar. I am Michelle Chikulski Bradley, Chair of the Appraisal Standards Board. I'm a certified general appraiser and AQB certified USPAP instructor just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I practice in the residential real property world. Thank you for attending.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicholas Piltz. I'm in Orlando, Florida. I'm a certified general real estate appraiser and an AQB certified USPAP instructor. I work in the world of commercial, residential appraisal, and appraisal review.
Thanks, guys. And I'm Lisa Damaris, the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. I serve as the technical expert to the ASB and to the AQB as well. I was an appraiser in the field for 30 years prior to come work here at the foundation. Before we begin, we always have to do housekeeping, as everybody knows. We make sure that this runs smoothly and everybody knows what's happening. We are recording this webinar. You will see the recording post to our website and YouTube channel in less than approximately 24 hours after we finish. We will attempt to take questions as we have time at the end of the webinar. And to ask a question, you just move your mouse to the bottom of the screen and you will see that Q&A feature. We used to ask everyone to put it in the chat box. It's easier for us if you can put it in the Q&A feature, but if you happen to make a mistake, it's okay. It's just easier for us to manage if it's in the Q&A box. At the conclusion of this webinar, a very quick and brief survey will pop up. It's really quick, and we will hope that you would take a moment to fill it out because your feedback actually helps us design these webinars and improve them as we go along. So for our agenda today, we will discuss the proposed edits to the ethics rule mainly as presented in the fourth exposure draft, and then briefly review the proposed changes to the other parts of USPAP. Michelle and Nick will do their very best, as they always do, to explain the rationale for the proposed changes issued by the board. One thing I'd like to make note of is kind of our newer comment format. This is maybe the second or third time we've used this, but I just want to highlight it again. Once you have your copy of the fourth exposure draft on your computer, note that we have redesigned the exposure draft to be much more user-friendly. And you can either email us your comments, and the email address is noted in the exposure draft, or you can simply click on the comments link in the exposure draft. It takes you to a platform where you can choose how to upload your information or documents or comments that you want to give to us.
Thanks so much for going through all that, Lisa. Folks, if you have not provided your thoughts yet, we sure hope you do soon. The Appraisal Standards Board issued this fourth exposure draft back on December 13th. The feedback has been coming in steadily, and we ask for all comments to be submitted by February 3rd. That's in advance of our ASB public meeting, which will take place live via Zoom on February 16th. There will be a link to register right in the chat box for your convenience. As our viewers might know, the board does regularly solicit and receive comments and suggestions for improving USPAP. Proposed changes are intended to provide understandability and enforceability and to achieve the goal of promoting and maintaining public trust in appraisal practice. Now, Nick and I will go over the proposed changes that are shown in the fourth exposure draft in detail, and we will also take some questions. We do hope that most of your questions will be answered in our presentation. In addition, if the ASB adopts these changes, the board will also write guidance, possibly in the form of an advisory opinion, FAQ, Q&A, before any new changes become effective. So let's jump right in and get this started. We started with a discussion draft way back when in May of 2021, and we are now in our fourth exposure draft. I'll give you a very brief background on the history. So June of 2021, the ASB issued a discussion draft asking if the requirements for appraisers to avoid relying upon unsupported conclusions was understood by appraisers and users of appraisal services. The discussion draft also asked if that requirement sufficiently communicated that USPAP prohibits discrimination. Stakeholders responded that they felt the existing statement in the conduct section of the ethics rule. This is the one that says an appraiser must not perform an assignment with bias. We heard that that did not adequately communicate the breadth of USPAP's prohibition against discrimination and the legal landscape related to this prohibition. Overall, the predominant feedback that the ASB received on the discussion draft and on comments to the subsequent exposure drafts was that the language in the ethics rule was insufficient to make abundantly clear that USPAP does prohibit discrimination. As a result of this feedback, and after considerable time spent consulting with anti-discrimination experts, on December 13th of 2022, the ASB released a fourth exposure draft. This draft continues to propose adding a non-discrimination section within the ethics rule and deleting all language relating to supported and unsupported conclusions in the conduct section of the ethics rule. The ASB received a significant volume of comments and feedback, which has been predominantly in favor of including a new non-discrimination section. The board has heard that there is a need for greater clarity on the concepts, particularly the legal concepts, and that they are being introduced into this proposed new section. Significant feedback was also received indicating that this section should be revised to make clear whether it applies as well as how it applies across all appraisal disciplines. Finally, feedback expressed a need for the proposed non-discrimination section to better conform with USPAP terminology and style. As a result of this feedback, the ASB has prepared the proposed changes to the ethics rule. These changes were undertaken in consultation with fair housing, fair lending, and anti-discrimination experts, as well as with stakeholders within the appraisal profession. These changes, if they are adopted, would emphasize that the ethics rule prohibits both unethical and illegal discrimination. The fourth exposure draft proposes changes to the structure and language for the non-discrimination section as compared with the third exposure draft. However, among other things, it maintains the previous draft's focus on applicable legal concepts from key anti-discrimination laws. Now, let me repeat this. The proposed non-discrimination section continues to propose omitting all material relating to supported and unsupported conclusions. This is how it looks on your screen here, you'll see. Note that the bullet point proposed to be stricken is the one related to the supported, unsupported conclusions.
Thank you, Michelle. How about now we jump right into the non-discrimination section? So Michelle, what would you like our listeners to know about the why behind why the ASB is proposing this new section to the ethics rule?
Well, Lisa, first, I would like to just take a moment. I want everyone to see where we're proposing the addition of this new language be. Please see here on your screen the last sentence that the ethics rule will be divided into 4 sections, which includes the non-discrimination section as well as the others that already exist within the rule. Now we'll jump to the why. I want to make some general comments on this section. This proposed new section is designed to maintain and further the ASB's commitment to the highest professional standards in appraisal practice. The proposed non-discrimination section sets forth two broad prohibitions: a prohibition against unethical discrimination and a prohibition against illegal discrimination. Following each of these two prohibitions are additional requirements and comments, which provide interpretations and establish context. Now, although there is a relationship between anti-discrimination laws and unethical discrimination, the prohibitions against unethical discrimination and illegal discrimination are not the same. In addition to the prohibitions against illegal as well as unethical discrimination, the proposed new section includes limited permissive language about when use of a protected characteristic is allowed. The proposed new section also includes a prohibition relating to pretexts. And finally, the ASB plans to issue new guidance, including new advisory opinions that illustrate the concepts in the proposed section. Guidance illustrates the applicability of the proposed changes in specific situations and offers advice from the ASB for the resolution of specific appraisal issues and problems. This type of information is more appropriate in guidance than within the body of the ethics rule itself. Now, the proposed rule uses two separate terms. Now, you've heard the ASB talk about unethical discrimination and illegal discrimination to describe the requirements and prohibitions that an appraiser must be aware of. We have received questions about the difference in these two terms. These two prohibitions are related to one another, but they are not the same. An appraiser's ethical duties are broader than the law's prohibitions. I'm going to repeat that one more time just because it's so key. An appraiser's ethical duties are broader than the law's prohibitions. Yet unethical discrimination can occur without running afoul of any particular law or regulation that outlaws discrimination. That said, if an act constitutes illegal discrimination, it will also constitute unethical discrimination. By explicitly discussing both unethical and illegal discrimination, it makes it clear that the proposed new section prohibits discrimination in the sense in which it is commonly understood today. So as proposed, the ethics rule unambiguously and unconditionally states that USPAP prohibits unethical discrimination, regardless of the applicability of any particular law. You see on your screen, an appraiser must not engage in unethical discrimination. The rule then continues with this prohibition's requirements. This first prohibition concerns unethical discrimination when developing and/or reporting of an opinion of value. Across all appraisal disciplines, an appraiser is prohibited by the proposed rule from developing or reporting an opinion of value that is based on a protected characteristic of any person, unless the development or reporting fall within the limited permissive language that I will get to very shortly. The proposed rule begins by focusing on developing and/or reporting an opinion of value for several reasons. First reason is because it is a key function of appraisers, and it does deserve very special attention. Second, some activities will necessarily require consideration of that protected characteristic, but will not necessarily raise discrimination concerns. Let me give you an example. An appraisal review that is undertaken to determine whether an initial appraisal is discriminatory on the basis of a protected characteristic. That is an activity that will necessarily require consideration of that protected characteristic. And third, appraisers might undertake other activities, such as research or teaching, where they will need to use or rely upon protected characteristics. However, these activities, along with all other appraisal-related activities, still may be prohibited unless they satisfy all of the conditions set forth in the limited permissive language portion of the proposed non-discrimination section. Now, the prohibition related to developing and or reporting opinions of value identifies key concepts. Key concept of protected characteristics. This list includes a non-exhaustive list of protected characteristics consistent with the key protected characteristics that are recognized under U.S. federal laws and regulations. Actual or perceived is another key concept. The proposed section uses the words actual or perceived protected characteristics. This means that discrimination can occur because of an actual protected characteristic, meaning, for example, a person is actually Hispanic. Or it could occur because of a perceived protected characteristic, meaning a person is perceived to be Hispanic, possibly, for example, because she has a last name that is believed to be Hispanic, but the person is not actually Hispanic. Another key concept is persons. Within the context of the proposed non-discrimination section, persons includes a property owner, an asset owner, a purchaser or potential purchaser of a property or asset, an individual who might derive benefit from or use property or asset, a client, representative agent of a client or any other intended user, or the inhabitants of a geographic area. This list is explicitly not exhaustive. The second prohibition. The second prohibition prohibits appraisers from performing an assignment with bias with respect to the actual or perceived protected characteristics of any person. Performing an assignment is broader than developing or reporting an opinion of value. Using this phrase, performing an assignment, functions as a catch-all provision, prohibiting unethical discrimination beyond just developing and or reporting an opinion of value. The term bias is a defined term in USPAP. We know that. Our listeners likely also know it is defined as a preference or inclination that precludes an appraiser's impartiality, independence, or objectivity in an assignment. This second prohibition comes after the prohibition regarding developing and or reporting an opinion of value, because that first prohibition does not depend upon bias. The use is unethical regardless of bias, unless it satisfies all elements identified in the limited permissive language. So now I've mentioned this limited permissive language a few times now. Let's talk about the specifics. If you're following along in your exposure draft, this is noted on page 15. So following these two prohibitions that we just went over, the proposed non-discrimination section then lays out the limited circumstances where an appraiser may use or rely upon a protected characteristic in an assignment without it constituting unethical discrimination and violating the ethics rule. The use of or reliance upon a protected characteristic, for it to be permissible, all three of the elements I'm about to go over must be met. First, the laws and regulations expressly permit it or otherwise allow the consideration of that characteristic, and use of or reliance upon that characteristic is essential to the assignment and necessary for credible assignment results. And consideration of that characteristic is not based on bias, prejudice, or stereotype. All three must be met. Now, the first element is clear. For use or reliance upon a protected characteristic to be ethical, of course, it must be legal. The second and third elements relate to the fact that what is legal is not necessarily ethical. The second element requires that use of or reliance upon a protected characteristic must be essential to the assignment. In other words, inherently part of the appraisal problem to be solved, not merely incidental. It also must be necessary for credible assignment results. In other words, a valid solution to the appraisal problem cannot exist without that use or reliance. Finally, the third element emphasizes that an appraiser's consideration of a protected characteristic cannot be based on bias, prejudice, or stereotype, which by their very nature are unethical. The ASB plans to provide guidance relating to the acceptable use of protected characteristics, including examples of when laws and regulations permit consideration of a protected characteristic and what constitutes a stereotype. Now, in feedback to the third exposure draft, questions were raised about the applicability of the proposed non-discrimination section to appraisals for age-restricted housing in real property appraisal practice and other similar situations where consideration of a protected characteristic might be required. This proposed new section makes clear that an appraiser would not violate the ethics rule by taking into account protected characteristics necessary to carry out that specific type of an appraisal. So let's look at an example. We'll use age-related housing as an example. It is expressly permitted by the Fair Housing Act, so that satisfies the first element. And because of the nature of age-restricted housing, consideration of familial status is both essential to the assignment and necessary for credible assignment results. And finally, because of the requirements for age-restricted housing, consideration of familial status would not be due to bias, prejudice, or stereotype. So this type of assignment meets all three elements necessary for the limited permissive language. These requirements are intentionally stringent. One of the goals of the proposed change is to emphasize that any use of or reliance upon protected characteristics in appraisal practice must be approached with the utmost care and only permissible in rare instances where it is not only legal, but also necessary for credible assignment results and essential to the assignment. The ASB intends to provide guidance regarding the circumstances in which use of or reliance upon protected characteristics is permitted under the proposed non-discrimination section. These circumstances will remain narrow, which is clear from the language. It's important to remember that public trust in the appraisal profession is paramount. The public must know that those involved in the profession understand and intend to follow all legal obligations, including anti-discrimination laws. The proposed changes make this clear by including straightforward language and references to key anti-discrimination laws in the ethics rule. This makes it clear to the public and appraisers that the appraisal profession takes a firm stance against illegal discrimination. The prohibition on illegal discrimination starts with a declaration similar to the prohibition on unethical discrimination. You can also see on your screen here, an appraiser must not engage in illegal discrimination. Now, the comment that follows provides some context as well as important information related to anti-discrimination laws and what constitutes illegal discrimination. The entire comment is on your screen. I see it fills up the screen. You can reference it on pages 15 and 16 of the fourth exposure draft if you're following along. In this comment, the proposed new section highlights key federal anti-discrimination laws in the United States for appraisers to understand and follow, specifically the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. These laws establish the minimum level of anti-discrimination requirements in the United States. Because an assignment will not necessarily trigger every anti-discrimination law, the comment specifies that an appraiser has a duty to understand and comply with the laws that apply to the appraiser and the appraiser's assignments. The comment uses the Fair Housing Act as an example. Some comments on the third exposure draft expressed confusion about the applicability of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to appraisal practice. The current draft retains those references to these statutes because they are applicable to appraisers in some circumstances. Guidance promulgated can provide more detail about these and other laws and their potential application to appraisers and appraisals. Finally, the illegal discrimination discussion here introduces the legal concepts of disparate treatment and disparate impact, which are central concepts within anti-discrimination law. Although some comments received from the third exposure draft expressed confusion about these concepts, the ASB determined they are critical for appraisers to understand. Again, guidance can provide further explanation about these legal concepts and how they relate to appraisal practice. The proposed new section also prohibits appraisers from engaging in pretext to conceal the impermissible use of or reliance upon a protected characteristic. This prohibition applies at any stage in the performance of an assignment. As with the rest of the ethics rule, it also applies across all appraisal disciplines. In response to comments that found the concept of proxy to be confusing as presented in the prior draft, this current draft removes that language. The ASB intends to further explain pretext, as well as the concept of proxy as it pertains to anti-discrimination in guidance material.
Wow, thank you, Michelle. That was incredible. Thank you for a thorough explanation for these proposed changes. I'm sure everybody appreciates that. We will now move on to the topic of upcoming possible guidance. Nick, can you please tell us what we might expect to see from the ASB regarding guidance on the topics that Michelle just discussed?
Yes, thanks, Lisa. So should the board adopt the proposed non-discrimination section, the board intends to create detailed guidance on several topics. This guidance would include a discussion of the fact that U.S. federal, state, and local laws create legal obligations in a variety of contexts relevant for appraisers. The guidance could further discuss sources of anti-discrimination laws and regulations that are relevant for appraisers and appraisal practice. This may be relevant, for example, to identify protected characteristics beyond those ones listed in the proposed section. Guidance would spell out further the Fair Housing Act prohibitions on making housing unavailable on a discriminatory basis, and that this prohibition applies to appraisals of residential real property. Guidance could further explain that Fair Housing Act covers discrimination on a specific basis in residential real estate, including appraisals related to sales and rentals of residential property. An appraisal or even the development or reporting of an assignment result that are subject to the Fair Housing Act may not be based either in whole or in part on information involving any of those protected characteristics, regardless of the appraiser's intention, unless expressly permitted by law. So guidance would specify that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, ECOA, can in certain circumstances apply to appraisal practice, specifically in mortgage lending and credit context. Guidance can specify that ECOA prohibits discrimination on specific basis, and if ECOA applies, an appraisal or the development or reporting of assignment results may not be based either in whole or in part on information involving any of the specific protected characteristics. Again, regardless of the appraiser's intention and unless expressly permitted by law. Guidance could explain that certain sections of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 apply to the appraisal profession and appraisal practice, including before and during an assignment. For example, discriminatory refusal to enter into an agreement or contract, or in certain circumstances, guidance could be developed related to appraisals when real or personal property is inherited, purchased, leased, sold, or held. Let's talk now about disparate treatment and disparate impact, which was an important topic of commenters from the third exposure draft. Guidance would, in the if the fourth exposure draft were adopted, explain disparate treatment and disparate impact discrimination. Guidance can specify that disparate treatment refers to treating individuals of one protected group differently from and less favorably than others not in that protected group, in whole or in part because of their shared protected characteristics. Guidance can further specify that disparate impact refers to the use of neutral policies or practices that disproportionately harm individuals from a protected group when those policies or practices are not justified by business necessity, or even if justified, there is a less discriminatory alternative policy or practice that could adequately serve the justification. Guidance can explain that some anti-discrimination laws can be violated through disparate impact in addition to disparate treatment. Guidance would provide examples of disparate treatment and disparate impact that are relevant for appraisal practice. Guidance would explain that animus and or an intent to discriminate are necessary elements of either disparate treatment or disparate impact discrimination. Guidance would discuss the use of code words as it relates to proxy, pretext, and intentional discrimination. Guidance would discuss the concept of proxy, in particular as it relates to disparate impact. And finally, we can provide relevant appraisal-related examples on these topics and guidance. So moving along here, another topic that generated a lot of questions for guidance from the third exposure draft was neighborhood discrimination in real property appraisals. The guidance could explain in this case, protected characteristics include the demographic characteristics of people who live in or otherwise frequent the neighborhood where the specific property is located, and that the use of or reliance upon those specific demographics when developing or reporting assignment results is a violation of the ethics rule, unless use or reliance meets the requirements of the limited permissive language in the ethics rule. Guidance can provide examples that would illustrate appropriate or inappropriate use of demographics related to protected characteristics. So what is permissive language and when are the acceptable uses of protected characteristics? Another key concept question from third exposure draft. Guidance in this case could further explain that there are limited circumstances in which the use of or reliance upon a protected characteristic is acceptable through examples, such as an example that explains what constitutes a stereotype, as many commenters from the third exposure draft had questions about this topic specifically. Other examples could include the Fair Housing Act has a carve out for housing for older persons. Another example could potentially be that disadvantaged business enterprises as it relates to business valuation appraisals, and also the appraisal of certain genres of art where protected characteristics are inherently related to the genres at issue.
Oh, thank you, Nick. I'm sure that this guidance will be very helpful. I know you guys are all working on it very diligently behind the scenes. We will move on to some proposed changes from the prior. Is that right? The prior, or moving on the rest of the proposed changes? The ASB is still considering for adoption. Michelle, can you get us started on the topic of inspection?
Yes, I certainly can. As part of the scope of work, an appraiser decides whether or not to perform an inspection of a property that is the subject of an assignment. Now, we know that USPAP does not require a property to be inspected, but does establish minimum appraisal and appraisal review reporting requirements. USPAP does require that the appraiser recognize ethical obligations in a certification stating whether they did or did not perform a personal inspection of the property, and the report must disclose sufficient information for the client and other intended users to understand the report properly. Stakeholders have recently expressed concern over the reporting of the type and extent of an inspection of a property that is the subject of a report. There is concern due to changes related to inspection practices and sophisticated technologies appraisers may use to assist them while performing an appraisal. The ASB's proposed solution is to require the appraisal report to specifically include a clear disclosure of the type and the extent of any inspection of a property where that inspection was performed by the appraiser as part of their scope of work. The new disclosure requirements go beyond just disclosing when a personal inspection was made or not. The ASB is proposing deletion of the definition of personal inspection. The ASB proposes to add a sentence clarifying the scope of work reporting requirement to 3 of the standards rules 2, 4, and 8. Specifically, whenever 1 or more inspections of the property that is the subject of a report occurs, the report will be required to specifically contain information on both the type and the extent of that inspection. And in the instance of an appraisal review, whenever an inspection of the property that is the subject of the work under review occurs. The proposed change is intended to help ensure that clients and other intended users are provided with sufficient information about the appraiser's scope of work so they can understand the report properly. Currently, the standards rules related to appraisal and appraisal review reporting already require an appraiser to summarize or state the scope of work used to develop the appraisal or the appraisal review. Thinking about inspecting a property, until recent advancements in technology, the meaning of "I have made a personal inspection" was sufficient to understand the inspection. But in today's technological world, clients and appraisers themselves have indicated the "I have or have not" statement is simply not enough information. The proposed requirement to summarize or state the type and extent of inspection is intended to indicate the level of inspection that the appraiser determined was necessary for credible assignment results. So let's think about an example. An appraiser may report that the type of an inspection was a visual observation and the extent was from the street. This type of explanation can help clients understand that there are different levels of personal inspection. Yet the scope of work for other assignments may require a complete visual inspection of the interior and exterior areas of a subject property. The proposed new sentence applies only to assignments in which one or more inspections were performed as part of the appraiser's scope of work. So when an appraiser determines that an inspection is necessary for credible assignment results and performs an inspection, the appraiser must also include a summary or statement about the type and extent of that inspection. Now, on the other hand, if, for example, an appraiser was to receive from a client a copy of an inspection report about the subject property, this inspection report would not be categorized as part of the appraiser's scope of work for the assignment. And in the report, the appraiser would treat the inspection report in a manner similar to any other information analyzed to support the opinions and conclusions. In short, the proposed additional sentence requiring disclosure of the type and extent of an inspection in the report is applicable when the inspection is performed as part of the appraiser's scope of work.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And now, Nick, can you explain the proposed changes regarding transfer and sales?
Yes. So for real property, personal property, and business appraisers, under certain circumstances where the appraiser is required to analyze prior sales of a subject property, it has been brought to the ASB's attention that while a sale of a property is essentially a transfer of a property, there is a minor technical difference between the two. A sale always includes a transfer, but a transfer may not always technically include technically include a sale. As an example, for business appraisers, in the sale of companies, those sales are often structured in ways that are not considered true sales. They can be reorganizations, mergers, or other legal processes that convey or transfer an interest from one person or entity to another. There might even be partial transfers of businesses. So while USPAP guidance has always maintained that a sale and a transfer are essentially the same, enough questions have been raised about this issue that the ASB is now proposing this specific change. The addition of words "and other transfers," if adopted, would then appear in the development and reporting standards as appropriate. So I will go ahead and take us through now some of the definitions to retire, and the ASB is continuing to propose the following. The first on the screen here is definition of assignment elements. The ASB has proposed to remove the definition of assignment elements, as the current definition includes a list of the assignment elements as stated in the problem identification section of the scope of work rule, which are applicable in every appraisal assignment. However, in a few circumstances, the assignment elements listed in the definition may not be the exact ones that are applicable in some appraisal review assignments. The next definition to retire is the definition of misleading. If the definition of misleading is proposed for deletion specifically, it received much criticism. Although if this change were adopted, the term would revert to its common dictionary definition and would no longer have a specific USPAP definition. From there, we have personal inspection. The ASB has proposed to remove the definition of personal inspection. Removing the definition of personal inspection will revert to the common English dictionary definition again of the words personal and inspection. Then relevant characteristics. The definition of relevant characteristics is proposed for deletion to avoid drawing a distinction between the phrases relevant characteristics and phrases like property characteristics relevant to the assignment and characteristics of the property that are relevant to the type and definition of value. These two phrases have the same meaning as relevant characteristics, and defining one term but not the others implies there is a difference, yet there is none. So then we go on to definitions to modify. And The first one we'll start here with is the current definition of appraiser, which is one who's expected to perform valuation services competently and in a manner that is independent, impartial, and objective. The ASB is proposing to reinstate the following comment that appeared in the 2018-2019 edition, as seen on the screen. Prior to the removal of the comment had existed in the definition section since the year 2000. It was removed in the current edition after exposure to the public and multiple times with no objection. However, subsequently, it was recognized by stakeholders that the comment made it clearer that the expectation to comply with USPAP comes from and that comment was needed to fully understand the definition. Advisory Opinion 21 does explain the relationship between the expectation of who should comply with USPAP and the preamble explains the concept of what it means to comply with USPAP, although stakeholders stated that this was not enough. So therefore, the ASB is proposing to reinstate the comment exactly as it appeared prior editions of USPAP because the comment made it abundantly clear without having to look at different sections of USPAP, the USPAP publication, where the expectation comes from, and an individual who is acting as an appraiser should comply with USPAP. If adopted, the definition would appear exactly as previously appeared in 2018 and 2019 edition of USPAP. So we have another definition here, work file. So as proposed previously, the ASB is considering amending the definition of work file as shown on the screen here. The preamble states that an appraiser must maintain the data, information, and analyses necessary to support his or her opinions for appraisal or appraisal review assignments. Therefore, a main purpose then of a work file is to contain the documentation necessary to support the appraiser's opinions and conclusions. However, the work file also serves other purposes. For example, an appraiser can also choose to retain additional materials that go beyond showing compliance with USPAP, such as materials used to answer questions, to document correspondence with a client, or to provide background information on a business contract, for example. So to reflect what the ASB intends for a work file to contain and not restrict it to just materials specifically intended to show compliance with USPAP, the ASB proposes the modification shown here.
Thank you, Nick. There are some minor edits left to explain, and then we should be able to move on to a couple questions here. Michelle, can you lead us through these three sections?
Sure, and thank you everyone for sticking with us. I know this is a deep dive into the exposure draft, so we do appreciate you sticking with us. So sometimes changes require a closer look at some of the individual words used in USPAP. There are 4 proposed edits that update a term, create consistency between standards, solidify a concept that already exists in USPAP, or refine a meaning. These are not significant changes and should have minimal impact on an appraiser's day-to-day practice. But I will go through it nonetheless. The ASB is proposing to replace the words "a summary" to instead be "the description" in one sentence in each of the certification requirements for standards 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. So to explain this change, I'm going to use standard 2 as an example. You can follow this here on the screen. So in the reporting standards, and specifically in the certification requirements, there's a section that deals with significant appraisal assistance and where disclosures related to the assistance may appear in a report. As you see on your screen, you can see where summary will be replaced with the description. The requirements to report the extent of any significant appraisal assistance come from the requirements for an appraisal report and for a restricted appraisal report. Each requirement is, read them quickly as follows. For an appraisal report, Standards Rule 2-2, A says summarize the extent of any significant real property appraisal assistance. And of course, for a restricted appraisal report in 2-2B, a portion says state the effect of any significant real property appraisal assistance. So depending on which reporting option is used, the appraiser is required to, at a minimum, either state or summarize the extent of the assistance. And to be certain that both options are encapsulated in the requirement, the ASB is proposing to replace the word summary with the word description. Moving on to Standard 6. So Standard 6 addresses how an appraiser should report the results of a mass appraisal. The ASB has always held that Standard 6 does not include an option for an oral report. However, this exclusion is not directly stated, as recently noted by several stakeholders. So in response, the ASB proposes the current edit to the opening line of Standard 6. So this is abundantly clear. Again, you can see the proposed change on your screen. Last, the ASB proposes adding words to a requirement in Standards Rule 8-2B so that it is consistent with the exact wording that already exists in 8-2A. This proposed change has already been exposed several times for adoption. There's been no notable objections. It is not a concept change or an added requirement. Rather, the addition of these words just make the language of 8-2 internally consistent. That is all. You will see on your screen the proposed wording, and note that this also shows the proposed wording we discussed earlier in the transfers and sales discussion.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Nick. So we have about 7 minutes left here. What I'm going to do is, through the process of the common exposure process, we receive a lot of comments in, and we understand what is being misunderstood. We also see that today when we watch the chat and the Q&A box. What key topics are people wanting to have more information on? So from what I'm observing here, and based on what we know about the comments, Michelle and Nick, I'm kind of putting this together. To just kind of ask you some broad questions. Please, people, note that if you have left a comment in there that requires something back from us or a question, we do everything we can to try and get that information back to you. Or if we get so many particular questions on when we use that, when we are making our education material. So these things are useful to us, even if we are not able to answer it here today on the webinar. All right, so let's move right in. The first question, let's see here. So Michelle, you were talking about, the first prohibition in the non-discrimination section, right? And it includes, I think, what is the phrase? Race and national origin. So why are those two characteristics identified separately from the other list of protected characteristics that appear? Does that make sense?
So why does the term race and national origin appear in the rule separately? Okay, that's a great question. Well, so first, it's important that we were able to provide a couple examples of what constitutes a protected characteristic immediately in the rule, so that those referencing the rule would know what was meant. But reproducing the full list would have just made the rule too long and unwieldy. So we selected race and national origin, particularly because they're very helpful examples to orient readers within the rule. They are the best known cases and examples of unethical discrimination. It involves those two, race and national origin. Keep in mind, folks, that the selection of race and national origin as the example in that portion of the rule in no way diminishes the importance of any other protected characteristics. It was just important to provide examples so that appraisers and other users of USPAP can immediately understand the contours of the rule.
Okay, great. This question deals with neutral, the concept of neutral. Nick, I think you discussed that where the draft talks about neutral policies and practices. So regarding that concept of neutral, if the appraiser is being neutral, how can an appraiser ever be accused of being unethical?
Well, let me back up just briefly here and talk about disparate impact and when it occurs. So that specifically is a neutral policy or practice that disproportionately leads to a negative outcome for members of a particular protected class or protected classes. And then 2, if that neutral policy or practice does not have a legitimate business justification, or if there is an alternative policy or practice that would lead to a less disproportionate outcome. So it's important here to note that those two, to not isolate the first part of that, of the description of disparate impact. It's not the case that a neutral policy or practice is automatically discriminatory if it has a disparate effect. It's a multi-step analysis. So in short, there's more to the concept of disparate impact and than just the disproportionate impacts. And as we noted earlier, there is planned guidance to address, specifically address disparate impacts to help appraisers understand what it means and be able to comply specifically with the ethics rule.
Okay, great, thanks. 3 minutes. I'm just going to make this last one pretty simple because it seems to be kind of what I'm hearing here. Isn't all discrimination illegal?
Oh,
Nick, how about you?
go ahead, Nick. We get that question so often, so I'm really glad you asked that. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, we have separately bucketed these two prohibitions. Illegal and unethical are similar, but they're not equal. So if an act constitutes illegal discrimination, it's self-explanatory. It will also constitute unethical discrimination, but it's the appraiser's duty to be ethical, and that might be broader than the law. So explicitly discussing both unethical and illegal discrimination makes it clear that the proposed new section prohibits discrimination. Okay, great. Thank you. We are out of time here. Please ask your questions anyway. Email them to us anyway. Again, they help us write the guidance and the education material that happens around when whichever changes are adopted. They're absolutely critical to understand what you need to know. So what do you think? Do you have comments? Do you have questions for us? We encourage you to comment in writing to the board before February 3rd. So you can click on the link in the chat box to submit your comments to the ASB, and you can always email us as well. asb@appraisalfoundation.org. The board will also accept verbal comments at its virtual public meeting on February 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You should see a registration link in the chat box here, and you can always check out our events page, the Foundation's events page, and register for upcoming webinars. Nick and Michelle, any words before we sign off here?
Just thank you very much for your attendance, and I do hope that you provide comment letters back to the board.